Introduce ourselves.
Fran Aaron, a committee member.
Charlie Andy, Civitech.
Tim Schwecke, Civitech.
Lee Tall Commission member. Adam Tagan, Community Development.
All right, I know Joe, I met with him a few minutes ago and should be on his way any moment, so we'll go ahead and get started, guys, if you'd like.
Okay. So we sent out 2 memos. And the first one that we're going to talk about is the comp plan. That's the one with the fold-out map. And Charlie's going to run you through that real quick. So just kind of set the stage for this. We went, it was probably 2 months ago. We had a draft future land use map, so this is going to be part of the comp plan update. And, collectively changes were made, and then we, put that on the new map, and that's what's attached to your memo. We've got a large copy here to make any additional changes, and we've got it up on the screen. So I'm not sure if you had a chance to look at it, compare your, what we have in front of you as compared to what your notes were, or if there's anything else. But essentially, we just kind of cleaned up the map. We kind of looked beyond the municipal boundaries a little bit. We added.
So for comparison, I've got the one that we drew on that day.
Okay.
So you can see the extension here. You can see there was a few notes here and there. We went from different density residential to just straight residential. We went to quite a bit of mixed use or mixed residential that we added in places, specifically in here, up in here is mixed use. And then we got some public stuff that was listed as transportation, so we took care of that, cleaned that up. The one issue on the map that we may have to reconsider, and that's going to be part of what Tim's presenting based on the new legislation at the state, is the issue with conditional use permits. And he'll talk about that, but we made a mobile home park, and I believe that's in here. We made that residential with conditional use permit kind of thought process, and that may have to change depending on your legal opinion of that, what that may be. So those are really the changes that we made on there. I can kind of pass this around if you want to take a look at where the notes were made. But if you saw anything that concerned you after you looked at the map, that's kind of what we're here to ask. What your thoughts are as far as the future land use map of the comp plan. So that's really the only potential additional district, future land use district, that we may have to add, depending on, and that's a policy decision that you'll have to consider, is working through that Wisconsin Act, the statute change, conditional use permits. We may have to add an actual mobile home park future land use district.
Okay.
Makes sense. Just for those, and we'll talk about it more, but basically, if you open up your typical residential district to that conditional use, it's very hard to deny the conditional uses in the future. So the concern is, if mobile home parks are there, that opens up all residential areas to them. There's an appropriate place and time for those, and it may not be citywide.
And so that would also then become a zoning district.
Correct.
So we have pretty good language for mobile home park zoning district to allow for what's existing, but also to have a pretty good hold on anything that would be future, because you want to have a real good design if you're going to have more mobile home parks.
Very good.
Okay. The other memo is kind of a 2-page along with any number of attachments. And the first part of the memo talks about the committee of the whole meeting. I think we had a room full. I think all of the council members were here, if I recall. Had a real good discussion. Kind of went through an overview of the project, kind of talked about the timeline, some of the major objectives, and so on and so forth. And then we got into some more policy-oriented discussions and just trying to get their feedback. And we talked specifically about the procedure for reviewing conditional uses. Okay, we talked about early on about the potential of having the Plan Commission doing the public hearing and rendering a decision. Okay, that was the discussion, and the Common Council members were like, well, we want to keep that. And then we got into talking about if that's what they needed or if that's what they wanted to do, then we would have to kind of reconfigure how public hearings were conducted. Because historically, or what the practice now is, you guys do the public hearing, and then you make a recommendation, and then it goes to Common Council, and it kind of gets rehashed. And in order to kind of, fix that issue, the recommendation will be for conditional uses, for the public hearing to be a joint Plan Commission, Common Council meeting. So this room is going to be, full, or you're going to have to go elsewhere. But essentially, the Plan Commission and Common Council, everybody's going to be hearing the same kind of information. And the way it's set up now, or the proposal, is that you will still be making a recommendation to the Common Council. Common Council decides that. And that decision could be at that public hearing, or they could table the matter and then bring it up at a subsequent meeting. But the intent is to kind of compress the time frame, and ideally then the conditional use would be reviewed or acted on at the same meeting. But we'll talk about that whole process with a change in the state statutes relative to conditional uses. Okay. So that was kind of the major takeaway. Talked about that one matrix that kind of shows all the steps and who's going to be doing what. And the one thing I do want to talk to you about and clarify is for example, number 5, site plan of operation. You're going to be making the decision. Previously, you made a recommendation to the Common Council, and they decided. And I think they were fine with you, being the Plan Commission, making that decision. And then, as part of our review, we sent our copy to the attorney that we're working with, and he had some, I don't want to say, grave concerns, but he had some questions about, do you want to really open up the possibility for an applicant to appeal the Plan Commission's decision on a site plan to the Common Council? And he said and we knew this, it's not normally done that way, but at the time, it was kind of, perhaps a best recommendation so that the Plan Commission could make that decision, having that safety valve.
We talked about it really briefly at the committee, the whole meeting.
Yeah. So, having said all that, I guess our recommendation is for number 5, number 6, number 7, 14, 15, 16, those are things that you're going to be acting on to remove that local appeal to the Common Council. So it would not be part of the process. If somebody objected to your decision, they would take the city to court. So does that kind of make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I think it does. I think also that there may be, I'm thinking 1 of 2 scenarios here for the conditional use reviews. That if we're going to have a joint meeting, can it just be heard in front of the Common Council? Should the Plan Commission even be involved? Because ultimately, all it is a big meeting. And how would, I guess the question with that is, would the Plan Commission first take a vote to make a recommendation, and then at the same meeting?
Potentially.
Right.
Essentially, you would want to have the Plan Commission and Common Council do a joint public hearing so that everybody can talk.
Right.
So that everybody can ask questions and developer can respond. And if there's questions, in terms of public comment, then the Plan Commission and/or Common Council can talk to the individual who's making that comment. So you would want to have that ability for a full public hearing by both.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I'm just wondering, is there merit in the commission even
Making
hearing
a
it?
recommendation.
Making a recommendation? Alternatively, if the common council is acting as a plan commission and making those decisions, do they want to be trained in how to properly do so, right? Because there's, I mean, this is a small group. Adam can present, look, this is the method, this is what we're required to do by law, how we have to consider this. And because this is what this group does, and it's a small group, it's relatively easy to manage and go through the process and ask those questions and for us to understand the process. The council's a little bigger group. And are they interested in that? Right? I mean, I guess my question is, after the meeting, does the common council know maybe what they're asking for? Right? In order to, I mean, I think that's a reasonable question. That it's not as simple as just, yeah, that sounds like a good idea type of thing. So those are kind of the two scenarios, is that if the council is interested in being present at the hearing, making the decision, should it even be an issue this body even hears versus, right?
Well, the same argument can be made for a zoning amendment or any other action that traditionally this board has been in public hearing on, and then made a recommendation onto council. If they want to do it for conditional uses, is there a reason they wouldn't want that same process for a rezoning, text amendment, whatever that may be?
The only difference is state statutes is kind of silent in terms of the process for conditional uses, but for rezonings, you always have to have a recommendation from the Plan Commission.
Right.
And we'll get into this a little bit when we talk about conditional uses, but there's going to have to be a lot of training for both the Plan Commission and the Common Council with regard to what you can and can't say, and the conditions that you impose, and the factors that you have to think about when making your recommendation and/or decision. Because the playing field is just totally different now. So I don't think the Common Council is going to be any better off by itself than having the Plan Commission, because ultimately the Plan Commission is going to be looking at the follow-up site plan and plan of operation. So they're going to have questions perhaps related to that as part of the larger question, does this land use fit? So I guess my thought is still have your Plan Commission making a recommendation.
Okay.
Stay in the ballgame.
Okay.
Sure.
I think
So to
it
speak.
actually could be a situation somewhat of train the trainers. As Adam trains you as a plan commission, then just by your action during the meeting, the council is going to learn how you do business as a plan commission and understand that they're going to have to do business that same way.
Yeah.
And I think that's, you think that happens in a couple months, in 3 months, 4 months, oh, they've got it, right? But then there's turnover, and then, this goes on for a long period of time, right? And so I think that having that input and having that ability to train the council on land use decisions is a very positive thing, just because I think it's long-term. It's that marathon. So that's my opinion. After a few months of it, you might say, well, okay, they don't have to hold their meeting the same night to consider the recommendation, but they have to be at the public hearing and they can't take input between.
Sure.
If they get input in between, they get it, but they can't use that.
Right, they'd have to
They-
recuse themselves from,
Exactly.
Right.
So, that's the toughest thing of having the gap is the public, and specifically anybody opposed is gonna wanna have that conversation with the council member. And they just, your attorney has to keep reminding them, public hearing, once it's over, that applicant cannot rebut. They can't have their, what's it called, their due
Second.
process.
right.
So due process is public hearing, and that's it. And that's, we have that same issue in other communities that we work with.
And I think the Common Council too, I mean, they kind of got it when we were talking
Yep.
about it.
Mhm.
They were like, yeah. So nobody said, we wouldn't just keep on going the way we were going. So that's good. So the other change that we had kind of talked about was with regard to conditional uses. Your current practice is to send out letters to all those within 100 feet of the property. And at that time, they thought it would be more appropriate to have 300. And again, there's nothing in state statutes, one way or the other, in regards to doing a mailing and/or setting a distance.
I think that confusion came because of what you have to be to qualify as a legal objector. I believe that's where the 100-foot comes to play, so I think that's why the city has always traditionally done the 100-foot, so that anyone who gets that letter is technically able to legally object in effect to both. At least per our old code, you could actually require a supermajority on a conditional use.
Okay. Okay, so that was kind of the, some of the major points of discussion at the committee of the whole meeting. Now we want to talk about 27 Act 67. 2017 Act 67. So historically, as I kind of mentioned previously, state statutes really didn't talk about conditional uses. They said you can have conditional uses if you want. And going way back, what we refer to now as conditional uses were 30, 40 years ago referred to as special exceptions. And then they kind of flip-flop back and forth in terms of the term, meaning the same thing, special exceptions, conditional uses. So this Act 67 talks about both special exceptions and conditional uses, as if they were one and the same. But in our code, the way we drafted it, we use the term special exception differently, meaning a grant of leniency as opposed to a conditional use. So what we need to do is to come up with a different term for special exceptions, just to avoid any possible confusion. So it might be called a waiver, plan commission waiver, something like that. We'll get away from that term, special exception. But essentially, coming back to the traditional conditional use was you would have a listing of permitted land uses by right, and then you would have a list of conditional uses within each of the zoning districts. Applicant would submit their application, and it would go before a plan commission up to common council. And the basic question was, does that proposed use fit the lot, number one, and does it fit the area? I mean, in layman's term, it's, doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense to have that proposed use in that location, so on and so forth. And with Act 67, that whole way of looking at conditional uses is totally different. Now it's basically, the presumption is it fits. If it's listed as a conditional use, the presumption is it fits, unless the jurisdiction can provide substantial evidence that it doesn't. So the burden of proof is totally switched, right? And because of that simple, 180, so to speak, municipalities across the state are rethinking how they're going to be dealing with conditional uses. Already there's a couple jurisdictions that have adopted moratoriums on their conditional uses. They said, for the next 3 months, nobody can submit an application for a CU until we get it sorted out. Only because now, again, the burden of proof is on the jurisdiction. And the term conditional use basically connotates, you can approve it and you can impose conditions of approval. So conditional use. If you do this, then it fits. And with Act 67, even there again, if you impose a condition that you've always been doing, you have to provide substantial evidence for why you're doing it. Okay, so not only does it come into play, that substantial evidence come into play with your initial decision, it applies to all the conditions that you might impose. Okay? Does everybody see kind of the gravity of the that situation? Because the way we crafted the code was to, quite honestly, rely on conditional uses.
In the old frame of mind where it may or may not fit.
Right.
And this says it fits.
Unless you,
Right.
yes. Yeah.
And you would have to identify what conditions are reasonable for it to fit.
Right.
But it fits. Okay.
So, on the second page, just some ideas for us to think about. Basically, let's say we're at the 11th hour, but we're essentially at the 11th hour. This happened, December, and it kind of percolated around and whatever, and now we're trying to, figure out the extent that you want to circle back and take some additional time to rethink how the proposed code is drafted with regard to conditional uses. If you said, we're happy with what we have and the way it's drafted, that's fine. But probably you should be thinking about kind of, taking some additional time. I don't want to say a lot of time, but, circle back specifically and talk about conditional uses. So the first strategy, so to speak, is to reclassify. We've got the land use matrix, and we've got, I'm not even sure how many it says, but over 250 different conditional uses in various districts. And maybe, to kind of get away from the potential of having to say yes only because you can't prove otherwise, you might want to, take a conditional use now and reclassify it either as being permitted or prohibited. Okay? And I've got a handout with some ideas for you to think about, but essentially, I think the logical outcome is you're going to be taking a second look at that matrix and just crossing off conditional uses.
Not entirely.
Not entirely. And,
So if it's prohibited, though, is that something someone could still apply for a special exception
no.
They'd have to
No.
rezone to a different
to make it work?
district where it's either allowed or conditional.
Right. So there are some uses, if my recollection is correct, where it isn't just allowed, that it is.
There are some land uses that are CCCCs all the way across.
Right. So we need to identify at least one district where it's allowed. Is there a term that can be reasonably used to
Circumvent.
right? It's not a special exception, it's not a conditional use, but if it's not one of those terms, it's not a statutory.
Well, just because you don't call it a conditional use and you treat it like that, it means it is.
It still is.
Okay.
It still is. And actually, this just kind of happened with a couple committee meetings at the state level, and then it just happened. So there's going to be a lot of, attorneys trying to figure out what this all means. So I think we're basically stuck with what it says.
Okay.
If it's kind of a permissive approval, so to speak, and that's what a conditional use is. It's permissive. Then it falls under this new category.
As practitioners, obviously, we're not exactly thrilled with the legislation, but it is what it is.
Mhm.
As consultants, it's gonna give us a lot of work.
Mhm.
So.
So basically, yeah, you know, just kind of building off of that, the best thing that we can do is to minimize your risk. Minimize your risk. And you don't want to, you know, have some kind of land use in your table that is a conditional use, and then you have a room full of people coming to the public hearing, saying that they don't like it, so on and so forth, and you have to say, well, there's not much we can do. Okay, so you don't want to find yourself in that position.
I want to circle back to what you said, though. If you have a use that's C all the way across, conditional use all the way across, that's not, I mean, it's not wrong. It's not a bad thing if it fits
Right.
all the way across, right?
Well, that's
Should it be-
that's the complication,
Should it
right?
be authorized or conditional in that case? Well, if you feel that you could find some data, or you could find some analysis that would prove that it doesn't fit, then conditional use is okay. Do you know what I mean? So if you have traffic counts, or you know, something that you can say, if the traffic counts are higher than this, or lower than this, you know, then you've got a standard to approve or deny the conditional use. But again, we'll have to review it with John, because we're planners, and you'll have to review it with your corp counsel, because it's a legal opinion.
Right.
And they're still gonna work through it. But, you know, as long as you look at it as it fits unless, and if you can find the unless and prove the unless, then you're fine.
But the bar is, it's way up here.
Right.
Okay. The other point was, coming back to what you were saying too, though, within each district, you have to have uses that are permitted by right. You can't have every land use being a conditional use. Okay? But you can have conditional uses all the way across each and every district, so.
And there are uses that you don't have to allow either permitted or conditional. That's kind of like the decision we made on like quarries, I believe it was.
Yep.
So again, if you're on the fence on the use, that's the other road, is just, city is not going to entertain that particular use.
So really, the question that we have for you as a plan commission is, how much time do you want to take to kind of step back and think about this issue, with the examples that we've brought to give you to take a look at, and when do you want to do that, and how does that affect our schedule?
And as it turns out, you know, we'll get there, but you know, potentially, the things that we do in the zoning code can be reflected in the future land use map. So having opened up this can of worms, so to speak, and
Has helped with that.
yes. So it's not like you have to open up your comp plan, it's open already, and we've made great progress. We'll just have to, you know, tweak some things on the future land use map, if in fact that's called for, okay? So reclassify, change C to prohibited or permitted by right. So the second kind of strategy is to redefine the different land uses based on the scope. Okay? There are little churches, there are big churches. There's big stores and little stores. There's big apartment buildings and little apartment buildings, right? So that's kind of the concept, is you can take a single land use and you can break it into different scales, small, medium, and large. And then that will come back and be reflected in your land use table. I'll just hand this out now, because it might be helpful to look at something while I'm talking about this. So on the first page, and don't worry about all the red, but just by way of example, in the current draft of the code, we had multifamily 2 units, multifamily 3 to 8, and then previously we had multifamily 9 or more. Okay? And that 9 or more was a conditional use, with understanding that, again, does 15 units fit on that parcel? Does 50 units fit on that parcel? Okay? So what can be done is to piggyback this with another strategy to basically create another level, 16 or more, and then keep that conditional use, but put it in its own zoning district. Okay? That way, if somebody is zoned, R4, R3, which allows up to 16, and if they want more, then they have to rezone. And when you're rezoning, that's totally legislative. When it's legislated, you can say no. It doesn't rise to the same level of having to disprove something. You say this fits or it makes sense. It makes sense or it doesn't. Okay? So that's an example of breaking a single land use down into different scales to protect that upper end of the unknown, so to speak.
The danger of that, though, is if something gets zoned for that particular use, unless it's exclusive to that one use, and that use goes away, you better rezone it back.
Right. You get to kick at the cat one time. Okay?
Right.
You're talking about once that cat goes away, then something else can come in that's also authorized either by right or as a conditional use.
That's where making sure that you've got that scope or the size of the project right. So if that one project was appropriate there, the next project should be appropriate there also.
Okay.
That's
Right.
the kind of the concept of making sure the scope is set.
Okay.
So essentially, using that strategy, it's basically a conditional use. You've got total control, you can say yes or no. Yes or no, we're not going to rezone it. And when somebody's submitting an application for a rezoning, you're going to say, okay, well, how many units are we talking about? And they're going to have to provide some sort of documentation for, number of units and layout and so on and so forth as part of the rezoning process. It's not going to be a simple, we want this. You're going to say, sure, but tell us more. And that more is going to help educate you in determining or treating that use as a conditional use by the rezoning process. Okay, is that going to
But
make sense?
obviously, you can't, but the rezoning is still a yes or a no. It's not a yes subject to conditions.
You can play with that.
Okay.
You just have to be careful how you call it. You can't do rezoning, you can't do conditional rezoning,
Right.
but you can do a rezoning with conditions. And there's a legal difference between those.
The conditional rezoning, the legal term is contract zoning. If an attorney hears contract zoning, you're
Right.
done. They don't want to hear that.
For example, if somebody, walked in and said, I wanted to rezone this property to allow 50 units, you look at their development plans, and then it's conditionally, it's rezoned with conditions. One of those conditions is developer submits a site plan of operation within the next year, and they get approval of the same. Okay? That ties it, very, very tightly to what the proposal is.
The submittal.
The submittal. If they don't, follow through, then that zoning goes away automatically. You don't have to do anything.
As opposed to the rezoning is approved, however,
You have to do
more
these things.
specific conditions, like it shall only have 42 units.
Yep.
They shall be 2-car garage use, that type of thing.
Yep.
Okay.
So in essence, you'd be asking your community development director to potentially negotiate with the developer prior to the zoning meeting.
Sure, I mean, you want to have a pretty clear indication of what is going to be built as part of the rezoning.
They don't necessarily have to negotiate. I mean, if the submittal comes in and the submittal passes through to the plan commission and the council, and it's approved based on the submittal, but only based on the submittal, the condition is, you know, the site plan's already been done, submitted, it's built as, you know, it's not allowed to be changed from that.
Sure.
So there's no negotiation in that situation. There may be some negotiation where, you know, after a few years, your community development director has been through the process, he knows the history, he knows that the council's not going to approve this. And so he tells the developer, they're not going to approve this. But if you did this, they might. You have, so that history helps him, or whoever's your development director at the time, to deal with it.
So what would happen in a scenario where developer wants to do a 40-unit multifamily, and the planning commission and the council hear a zoning change request, and they really only want a 30-unit? You can't make it conditional upon 30, so you gotta turn it down.
Correct.
Yep.
Then, how do they potentially tell the developer, well, gosh, if it were 30, we'd be interested?
You know, I mean, that can happen informally.
Okay,
I mean, there's nothing wrong with that to say, well, you know, developer, what went wrong? Well, I'll tell you. If you came in with 30, you would have a better chance.
okay.
And really, I mean, you can kind of put, you know, develop clues in your findings of fact with the rezoning to say 40, you know, units is just too much, 30 might be more appropriate, or, I mean, you can, you know,
Okay.
word that finding so that there's enough in there so that if they come back the second time, they'll have a better indication.
So, does a deed restriction need to be recorded on zoning with conditions?
Nope. Basically, the ordinance would be drafted.
Okay.
The ordinance would be drafted to say, if these conditions are satisfied within this time period, then the city will change the map, the city will, you know, do whatever, and then it will be that. You don't change the map until the conditions have been satisfied within that time period.
Interesting. Seems very strange to me.
But it seems like the zoning code goes from this to this potentially, so they can get out of hand in a hurry.
Well-
You can see in the example here, what it seems to be doing is you're almost customizing your zoning districts by a lot.
Yeah.
Lot
You're
by
gonna
lot
end up
basis.
with 20 zoning districts potentially instead of 8.
And-
Because you're
and-
trying to,
It goes from more flexible to less flexible.
all right.
And we talked about that at the beginning of the discussion, is how flexible does your code want to be? Well, this statute change has kind of forced us to be less flexible.
Right. Yeah, the whole goal was to minimize the number of districts and use conditional uses and create that flexibility.
Right.
And now we're back to square one. We haven't talked about it yet, but pretty quick, we're going to be talking about adding probably 3 or 4, maybe 5 new districts to function the same way as conditional uses, unfortunately.
And it is what it is, right?
It is what it is, you know.
It's just.
On the bright side, we're in this process versus.
Yeah.
Right,
Just
exactly.
adopt
We're not
this
wrong,
thing, you know,
right.
I mean, they're-
And you don't really have to retrain anybody. You know, we're giving you terms that you know. Your thought process is already there. So, I mean, if this came about when you were 5 years out from this, then again, it's retraining, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, you know, I don't want to say it for the third time, but I will. But essentially, you know, as we're kind of talking through some of these strategies, what it's doing is it's reducing the number of potential development projects that can happen on a given piece of property. You're going to be striking those conditional uses. That's no longer going to be a development option. So the perverse, you know, result of this is property owners are going to have fewer and fewer options. I mean, it's just
Which is
terrible.
exactly opposite of the strategy that the legislators were trying to do.
Right. So it's just, it's beyond belief. But anyways, enough said.
We vented enough.
Number 3, the current code in Appendix B, I believe it is, lists all the different land uses and then lists all of the supplemental standards, right? If you do a bed and breakfast, then you have to do X, Y, and Z. And if you do that, whether it's permitted by right or as a conditional use, those are the bare minimum things you have to do. So what we'll have to do is for some of those land uses is to kind of build in some of the standard conditional uses or the conditions of a typical conditional use into those supplemental standards to say that if this use is approved as a conditional use, then additional things apply. And you can do that.
Screening as per approved by the planning commission.
Yep. Or if the minimum lot size is, 20,000 square feet, now for that conditional use, it's going to be 3 times that size. And in that way, you're kind of narrowing the potential of, again, having an undesirable conditional use on a same size parcel. You're going to minimize the potential for that kind of situation.
Or
So-
even utilizing parking, for example, on a smaller commercial lot, if it's a conditional use,
Right.
it requires more parking, so it pushes it towards a larger, more appropriate location.
Yep. Yep. So the fourth strategy is to adopt new zoning districts. And we kind of talked about this previously. And in the matrix, the land use matrix that I handed out, so we had rural residential, R1, 2, and 3. And what we're proposing is to add R4. So this would be the high-density apartments.
Okay.
Okay? And then R7 is going to be the mobile home park. And there's going to be, it's still going to be a conditional use. But that's the only place where you can have a manufactured home park is in the is in the R7 district. The other one that we added was, after the B5, is PI, public institutional. And then, actually, on the drive up, I was just kind of going through this in my mind. And actually, we'll look at it, but potentially there's going to be one more new district, and it's going to be the Park and Recreation District. Okay?
Refresh my memory, had we discussed previously already a potential transition?
Yes, and
Commercial
we'll
district
add that.
as well?
Yep.
Okay. So I can see commercial, that's one of those areas that I really see issues with this whole new conditional use.
Yep.
Just mentally going through, I think a lot of the conditional uses are generally commercial related. But
Yep.
Yeah, related to those activities that we wanted to have some sort of condition placed upon them.
Yep.
Kick up a cat, so to speak.
And then the last strategy, number 5, is to remove non-conforming conditional uses. That was something that we've used successfully elsewhere, but essentially, recognizing that there are going to be non-conforming uses. And as they exist, they might be fine. They're just not going to be a problem. So you would want to create some kind of formal mechanism to say that they're a legal non-conforming use, which might allow them to expand a little bit, if it makes sense. So we built that process in, and with this new legislation, we'll have to take that out. Okay? Because essentially, if somebody has a non-conforming use and you've got this process in here, then they say, well, I want to, make my business 3 times larger than it is, and you'd have a hard time, I don't say impossible, but you'd have a harder time saying no. So let's not even give them that potentiality. So we're going to strike that. Okay. Any questions on those? And it's kind of a mix and match in terms of where we apply what. And a lot of this is just going to be borne out in this table itself. Before I forget, though, basically we've been talking about the implications of Act 67, basically on this, but there's also going to be implications for how you do your process. Okay? So, whenever you have a conditional use, probably you're looking at 2 meetings, even though we talked about kind of consolidating things. Because essentially, with every conditional use, you're gonna have a document that is gonna be your conditional use order, or your approval document, or something. To say you can do your conditional uses, these are the conditions, and these are the reasons, and so on and so forth. It's a formal document. And what you wanna do is to, at the first meeting, figure out if you're going to approve it or not. And if you're going to deny it, you have to have time for staff to actually work on that document and write it and run it by counsel, or not counsel, but your legal
Corp counsel.
corp counsel, to say, will this pass muster? Okay, so that's why you shouldn't make that decision at the meeting, not having that document in front of everybody. The document and all the reasons and all the justifications.
So in a way, the motion from Plan Commission is to direct staff to prepare a document of denial, for example.
Yep,
That's what
and they
would
would say, these are the reasons why, why we're thinking about it, this is our final decision, but this is our direction. We're directing, staff to work on this document, bring that at the next meeting, and then they can say, yep, this is consistent with our thought process, because ultimately they have to say, this is our document. And there might be some tweaks and so on and so forth. So again, this whole change is going to draw out the process even more, unfortunately. We kind of talked about, the training, and the way the public hearings are conducted is going to be especially important, because the people sitting out in the audience, they need to know what kind of things are pertinent and what's not, okay? And maybe it's a simple handout that is given to all the people in the audience for conditional uses, listing all the criteria that we're gonna be thinking about, and if it's not one of these things, we can't consider it.
Or in the public notice even, that goes to the 300
Yep.
reference to standards for public hearing or something.
Yep. Because what you don't want to do is have people say, I just don't like it, okay? Well, you really can't, factor that in, right? It's not a popularity contest, right? And that's typically what has happened in the past.
Yep.
Or if somebody says, it's just going to create so much traffic, and therefore I'm against it. That's not enough for the Plan Commission or Common Council to say, that's the reason why we're denying or approving this. Our statements like that. If somebody says, I'm pretty sure that area of that property floods, okay, then the question has to be, asked by the Plan Commission staff or Common Council, would that individual come back up and provide additional, statements with regard to that? Do you have any evidence? Do you have proof? Do you have pictures? Do you have substantial evidence for that statement? And, it's going to be awkward, obviously, because citizens aren't really, tuned that way. They're going to be acting as experts, so to speak, not just opinion sharers.
Interesting.
Yep.
Have you guys done like cell towers with the siting legislation?
It's kind of like that.
Those can be really frustrating because the people in the audience basically don't have any say.
Yep.
This is
I
for
did
those in the
one.
But this is the new law, though, for the small cell towers in right-of-way, right? Or is this?
No, anywhere.
No.
Because there was some new legislation on small cell
And this-
towers.
Right.
the siting legislation for that and for large animal feeding operations basically says, if you can't prove. So it's very similar to this. It's even more prescriptive than this for the levels of proof. If you can't prove that this is going to hurt the health of the people adjacent to, if there's no proof, then you can't deny it. So, people in the audience, well, I think it'll hurt my health. Thanks, appreciate it.
Show us some direct reasons why.
Yeah.
So it can be pretty frustrating for the public, but
So obviously it's going to be a combination of any number of things, including that, kind of narrative as part of the mailing that goes out to the property owners, as part of the public hearing, whoever opens the public hearing, they can talk about, well, this is a conditional use, and we just want the public to understand that these are the factors, and we're handing out a sheet, and when you speak, make sure you speak to those, and if you have evidence, make sure you share it with us, and kind of, just put everybody on notice that this is how it has to work. So.
He changed his profession. What a game changer, though. I mean, on a
It
lot of
is.
fronts.
It is.
Like it's been said, I think it's a good opportunity now, given where we're at with this process, to incorporate these things. It's just a matter of, one, the question at the bottom, how much time do we want to spend revising this? At the same time, how flexible or inflexible do we want to make property uses? But I do like the idea that there still is some control opportunity through the rezoning process, and it's just trying to get my brain around how that is still control. I'm not quite fully, and not that we have to obviously discuss it today, but just it's going to be a change, and that's I think where the training comes in for commission members, future members of council. I mean, that.
So this submittal really gives you some things to work on and think about, and actually, once we started in the matrix and we started to kind of wrap our heads around how we were drafting the matrix, that went pretty fast. I think it will, once you start to look through the recommendations that we're making and start to think about the process change, it'll probably start to go pretty fast.
Sure.
You'll get through the first page and the second page will go faster. You know what I mean?
Good.
So, you can take these recommendations and just kind of figure out how long you want to spend with them.
So that's the one to do, is for the commission to meet and go through these and agree on what
I mean,
that looks
if
like.
you're so inclined, we could start now.
Okay.
Or if you just want to say 5 o'clock and we're done, or whatever.
I mean, I'm okay with giving, some, maybe taking a chunk of it now. I don't know if we'll be able to get through it all. Do you think? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, as long as we're here, I'd like to,
Crank through, see what we can get? Okay.
Yep.
Keep it moving.
yep.
Others okay with that?
So again,
Remember, quorum anyway, if you have to leave, you
Yeah.
can certainly leave.
Yeah, I have to. Not too awful long.
That's fair, yeah, so if you need to leave, feel free.
Okay.
We'll just crank through what we've got and.
okay. So again, we're adding R4, R7, and then the PI. And essentially, if you're looking at 1.03 agricultural support services, the reason why we call this out differently than a typical industrial use is this use might occur on the outskirts of town, kind of in the rural areas. And if we're going to take out the conditional use in the RR district, which is a recommendation, the thought is to simply scratch 1.03. Because the only place where it can happen is going to be in your industrial districts.
Okay.
Does that make sense? So we're scratching
So it's
one.
gonna be allowed by right then in?
Well, it's going to be, in terms of what it is, it's going to be defined as being industrial in nature or manufacturing in nature.
Period, and that's where it exists.
And that's where it goes.
Okay, all right, that makes sense.
Yep.
Unless somebody else is close to that, okay.
And I'm just going to go through these, kind of highlight 3.01, again, the manufactured home park, not conditional in any of the residential districts except in the mobile home district.
That makes sense.
Forestry,
Creating that
go
new
to
district.
202. You change forestry here.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
yeah. The other thing that we did, and kind of talked about this previously, is we added a classification to control the scope of multifamily and townhomes.
Yep.
So previously it was 9 or more. And again, more could be any number.
Yep.
So what we did again was to say 16 or more is still going to be a conditional use, but it's going to be in the R4 district, and we're not going to define any R4 districts on the zoning map.
On the map, makes sense,
Okay?
I think.
So it's kind of a two-step process for them, and unfortunately, they're going to have to rezone or first change the future land use map, Okay? And then once that's done, then they have to rezone.
Yep.
Okay?
And this is units per parcel, not buildings per parcel. So
Okay.
the 16 units could be in 2 buildings?
The way we have it is basically, you have to look at it.
Do we regulate buildings per parcel? Do you remember, Adam?
Don't believe so.
Okay. So it's just plain or simple 16 units per parcel?
Right.
Yeah, so the 9 or more units, that's talking about one building, the way it's defined right now. So for
Okay.
example, townhouse 9 or more units, a building containing 9 or more dwelling units. So in other
Per
words, they could
building.
have a 40-unit multifamily in the R3 district as long as no building was over 8 units in size. So they'd have to have 5 buildings, the way I think it reads.
We'll have to clarify that.
With this change, okay.
Yep. Yep.
Makes sense.
So jumping down to 402, 403, these are the community living arrangements, and some of these are allowed by state statutes, but we've got the provision about the number that we'll deal with.
Yeah.
But essentially, this says if they're to be allowed, where can they occur? Again, 405, foster homes allowed by right. Group daycare, what we would do is to simply pull that into the public institutional category and still treat it as a conditional use.
Okay.
Okay, previously they were allowed potentially in residential districts, no longer, unless the property is zoned for PI.
Okay.
Okay. Hospice care, same thing. Pulling that use under the umbrella of the PI district.
Okay.
Same thing with nursing homes and retirement homes, assisted living. Okay? Same thing with temporary residential shelters. And this gets at the issue of what Joe was talking about. You know, you might have a nursing home, and then for whatever reason, they transition into something different. And if they have that zoning, and if they're allowed by right or as a conditional use, then they can apply for it. Okay? So, 411, temporary residential shelter. Tend to be controversial,
Yep.
potentially. There's nothing in state statutes that says you have to have this as a land use.
So the option exists to remove it.
Right. But a city of your size, and given the, you know, the surrounding area where there just isn't gonna be many options for this circumstance, it's probably something that you should probably keep,
Sure.
only because there's a need.
I think that makes sense. I guess the question I have would be on the community living arrangements, you know, would there be a reason to create a smaller classification, knowing that those have been, and maybe your state law reference there is that we can't touch it less than 8, is that right? We can't create a smaller class of 4 or less.
That's basically an adult family home.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying
It's
is-
3 or 4
Okay.
units, and then usually, so community living arrangement for 8 or fewer is really 5 to 8.
5 to 8, okay.
Should we put 5 to 8 just to make it more clear?
It's
We'll have to-
clearer in the definitions, but
Yeah,
Okay.
Oh,
it's that.
okay.
We'll have to,
I'm just wondering if,
And that's a whole nother, I'll warn you guys, Sue and I spent 6 hours of my life over the last couple of weeks discussing those, because there's a state law that is so convoluted, and then there's,
Yep.
what's in the state law isn't necessarily legal because of decisions, and so that one, I
Okay.
guess, there'll be a lot, probably more information
all right, I don't
specific
want
to that
to
in the
take
future.
you down that rabbit hole, but, okay,
Yeah.
thank you for
It's-
sharing that.
It's not a fun subject.
okay, we were talking about 411, overnight lodging, 504. It was previously conditional use in your B5, your mixed district. I'm just thinking maybe just allow it by right. I'm just,
Yeah, our B5 is basically your Woodlands Business Park right now. is the largest chunk of B5 in the city. So whether or not you think a hotel or is appropriate in that location. To me, it fits in with an office use. The building type is similar, your
Yeah.
landscaping is gonna be similar.
Massey,
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's
It's gonna generally be located on major arterial, so I think there's, just my first blush is.
Yeah, I think we do.
Next one is 505 Resort. And again, this was contemplated to be potentially on the outskirts of town in the rural residential district. And again, thought is if it's going to be a conditional use or not a conditional use, then probably just strike this land use altogether.
I mean, is that, otherwise, is that a potential one where you just put in the minimum acreage in the standards so that it's still in the code, but you're putting it up, you know, to be a resort, it's gotta be 20 acres?
Lot size.
So that you're taking it out that way?
You could do it that way.
I don't know that
Yes.
we're gonna have a resort request, but I think that might.
Well, you know, with the river and whatnot, you know, potential is there.
Same Valley Development, yeah. Okay.
So maybe contemplate a number, a size, a minimum lot size that we could write into the standards.
Looks like, I think we do
Yeah.
have that.
Right now, we have 5 acres for a resort.
So you could bump that up to 25 or 35 or some number.
What do you think? 20 acres?
I don't know that I have a specific number in
Number in
mind,
mind,
but-
No more than 5.
Yeah, because I think if I'm remembering, that's, the rural residential has such a low density that it wouldn't be unusual to have a 5-acre residential lot. But if you're getting up into the 20-acre, for example, it can be somewhat unusual to find that spot.
Makes sense.
Okay. The next, recommended change is 701, heavy vehicle sales and service. B2, that's your, basically the 8th Street. And it's currently conditional use and, probably that's not the best use for 8th
Yeah.
Street.
I agree.
Okay. The rest of these are pretty well straightforward. 918 vet clinic. And again, the thought was potentially in the rural areas, that might make a suitable use. But option is to not allow it as a conditional use in the rural residential area.
Makes sense.
Okay. This next category, the Series 10, is recreation and entertainment. And this is one I was kind of struggling with, and potentially the solution here is to add a park and recreation district. So you would have to rezone to that in order to allow outdoor recreation or outdoor entertainment.
I think that makes sense.
Outdoor entertainment could be, water parks or, go-kart tracks and so on and so forth.
Yeah. So those
So-
activities then can be contained, or the standards can be contained then
Right.
within that zone.
And then you would have the first step of having to rezone it, potentially.
I think that sounds good.
Okay.
And so those would happen then in the
Right.
parks and open space,
Yep.
future land use class?
Right. So what we'll have is this category structure, and then we'll say that if you're in this, a particular classification, then you can apply for rezoning for X, Y, and Z. Okay? So we have, just by way of example, we've got one category for multifamily. We'll say the 2 categories that you can apply for rezoning is going to be the R3 and R4. So we'll have a matrix to say, this equals this.
We're talking about indoor recreation, indoor shooting ranges, we're talking about that area?
Yes, and in particular, outdoor entertainment, outdoor recreation.
Okay.
Those will go in that Parks and Land.
And it'd be permitted or conditional?
You can still do conditional uses, okay?
Okay.
Because essentially, if somebody doesn't like your decision to impose a condition of screening, okay, potentially they could take that to court. Or they're gonna say, you know what? So you always have to look at the risk of somebody taking it and saying, it's slippery.
Jen said the sidewalk is slippery, so
I know it
when I was
is.
leaving tonight, she said just be
Be
careful.
careful.
Yeah.
Everything's
Yeah,
increasing.
she just sent me a message. Thanks, Franny.
You bet, thank you.
So,
He's done in May, so we gotta have it done by then.
yeah, it's gonna be his last
Parting
hurrah.
gift, yep.
Okay, the next group is, a lot of land uses are going to go into that public institutional district that were previously allowed potentially by conditional use in your residential districts.
Sure.
Um, The next set, Series 12, you can see some of the proposed changes there. The next, kind of the tough one to tackle is going to be 1207, the major utility installations. Realizing that, chances are it's going to be the city that does it, right? But you kind of want to treat yourself the same way as you would a private developer. So a lot of those things would go into the public institutional district. Going down to transportation, 04, 05, those go into the PI district. General storage, again, our district, it might fit, but boat and RV yard, not allowed. And same thing with indoor boat storage. More appropriate for the industrial districts. Minor change on 1601, composting facility, again, could fit in the rural residential, but taking it out of there and putting it into the PI district.
Makes sense.
Now, 17 series talks about the different accessory uses. And the one I've got flagged is what we're calling the major home occupation, 1714. And again, that's kind of a single land use broken into minor, major. Minor is basically everything is done inside, it's kind of an office situation, nobody's coming and going, and those are just, allowed by right. And the major is like, you might have employees, or you might have clients coming and going. So the recommendation is to not allow that. I mean, it's just unfortunate.
I agree.
To have home occupation defined as a person working inside at an office.
Period.
So the scope work that we did there, minor versus major, has helped a little already.
Put it to use.
But we'd be completely striking the home occupation major.
Yep.
Any thoughts?
If we regulated home occupations better in the city, I guess I would have maybe
Well,
more
does the new
thought.
scoping kind of provide, I mean, it's gonna be some enforcement discussions, right? And
Yeah.
eliminating
You're
those.
potentially, I mean, on the bright side, you're moving them into a commercial district,
Yep.
but on the negative side, you're making the barrier to entry higher, because it's obviously a lot easier to start a business in your home.
Right.
You don't have rent, you don't have any of those other things. This is basically, as soon as you are beyond yourself, you are automatically pushing them into, there's not that interim step anymore. That's maybe more the economic development person than the
Well,
planner person in mind.
yeah.
I see what you're getting at, because
Otherwise, it's allowed.
I mean, as a
Right.
supplemental
We've had
standard, you can
issues.
say you get one employee.
Right.
I mean, you can say that. And
Sure.
whether it's permitted by right or conditional use, that's the standard.
Right. And that's basically how ours is right now, if I'm remembering correctly. Major is limited to one additional employee. I mean, it's still fairly restrictive, so it's not like it's opening it up to having 15 employees and a parking lot for 20 vehicles in a residential.
So you're thinking we could address it via as a conditional?
Well,
If you
either
left-
loosen
if
up
you
the
left
binder
it
a
in-
little bit
That's
so
what
that
I'm
you're
thinking, yeah.
giving a little more flexibility on what's in there and just keep the one category, but I think then you need to loosen it up or keep a second category and
Yeah.
Tighten it.
tighten it.
Make it conditional use, but the standard is one employee.
Yeah, or something. I could go either way, I'm hesitant to not allow any type of room for growth in a home occupation.
In those limited circumstances where it seems to fit and
Right.
it satisfies the condition. Yeah, I agree.
Well, the challenge is, if it's one additional employee, there is no, it seems to fit, right? It
Yeah.
fits.
Yeah.
And
Like the common one we always use is a hair salon. If you go with really restrictive minor regulations, you can't have a hair salon because they want to sell some hair gel or, beauty products accessory to it. Our current minor home occupation allows absolutely no sale of product. Now, is it really fair to push them into a major home occupation because they want to have 3 items for sale? So, yeah.
I could see loosening that up slightly, but
Right. So that's why I think one category works. It's just got to be that hybrid between restrictive and.
Okay, so the general consensus is to keep one category for home occupation, but just loosen it up just a little bit.
More of a catch-all.
Yep.
Yeah. I'll probably regret that, but I think that's what I think right now.
Well, this is not the last time we talked about it, so. The other one is 1717, we're allowing in-law dwelling units. So essentially a second dwelling unit within, a larger home. And when the in-law situation goes away, then the kitchen goes away and so on and so forth. And, I've never seen a situation where a conditional use for an in-law dwelling unit was denied. Because there again, you've got all those standards that says, if you do this, then you have to do X, Y, and Z. And it's basically a temporary kind of situation, it's not long-term. So my thought, recommendation perhaps is just allow those by right. Fair enough. As long as you've got those good standards, if they meet them, it shouldn't be a problem. If they've got one more additional parking space, shouldn't be a problem. Okay. The other changes are pretty straightforward, as are top of the last page. The other major one to talk about is going to be the off-site construction yard. For example, We Energies, when they're putting in a new overhead power line, they have to have some place for staging and their equipment and materials and so on and so forth.
I'm just going to back up a minute.
Sure.
For a swimming pool, do you want to include that in your Parks and Recreation District as well?
By definition, that would be included. By definition, this is a single-family.
Yeah, this is an accessory use.
This is accessory use. Okay, sorry.
No, that's. So 1808, off-site construction yards. Just not allow them in residential districts or in the B1 district. Still treat them as a conditional use.
I don't see that being too much of an issue. I'm thinking about where we've got activities that would warrant some of that construction, unless you can do.
No, that's really where they should be pushed. They're gonna be wanting to start early, they're gonna wanna be, the only other thing I could think of would be to try and use acreage again, to try and restrict it in some other districts, but. you really want them in a single-family district operating, even if it's a 10-acre site.
No.
I guess,
The other,
oh, sorry, I was gonna say with this change, I've kind of been on the fence for a while with the farm stand off-site
Mhm.
on requiring the conditional use. Or just, you know, because we have currently we're fairly permissive on our temporary uses of temporary sales and that type of thing on 8th Street. But I see we have it been permitted already. So I just didn't know if we wanted to.
Put a permit on BU.
B5.
I guess for the most part, really where you're trying to encourage them is 8th Street, that commercial corridor, so I think that works. Actually, now that
By putting B2 permitted.
now that I'm talking it out loud, I
Mhm.
think I have that concern.
Okay. The next one is seasonal product sales. So Christmas trees, fireworks, those kinds of things. I wasn't sure what to do about the rural residential. Is that, again, these things can be just a small 8x8 or 8x20 tent or,
Yeah.
you
It's
know,
pretty commercial
big.
scale, right?
They- Based on the discussion that's happened at council, I think they're not
Needs to
huge
go
fans
right.
in the residential district
Yeah.
at all, even in the rural residential,
Okay.
So straight.
assuming they don't change their mind tomorrow.
Yeah, right. We'll see tomorrow after tomorrow night for the decision that's.
So we actually have an amendment to allow produce sales in a residential district.
Okay.
And it failed last time.
Yeah.
Well, we're down a member tomorrow night with Todd being gone.
So that could have a little indication on both 1803 and 1811.
Not
Or
necessarily
1803.
1803.
Probably 04.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, more of a farm stand type.
Kind of the produce, you know.
Okay.
The off-site, for example, I think that would fall into that same question on seasonal products. If we're gonna take it out rural residential, it would probably come out of both.
Okay.
That's true, yeah.
They're fine with it in the commercial districts, but.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So that's how I did it.
Okay. So that was quick.
Yeah. Red is scary, I think. Red is a little daunting.
Reminds you of your English teacher
Yeah.
from high school.
Man, I really
What's
screwed
that?
this up.
And in some really weird cases, the response to a letter that goes out to a resident.
Yeah, right. Mhm.
I had someone correct it and send it back.
Oh, wow.
Was a retired English teacher who would.
You were schooled.
Flipped out, yeah.
Okay, so based on our discussion, based on what we did here, based on the, the feedback that we got at the committee of the whole meeting and what we talked about in terms of, tightening the procedure for conditional uses, we'll work on the next draft.
Okay.
And I'm thinking that what we can do is probably schedule the open house, with the new draft for mid-March, third week in March.
Let's just see if there's any dates there.
And that requires a 30-day comment period?
No,
The comp plan amendment.
the
does.
comp plan, right.
Yeah, third week looks like, I don't think we have really any, common council on Tuesday night, that's the only night where we've got a commitment, otherwise. I don't know if you-
So what we're looking at is kind of kind of an informal drop-in basis from, maybe 3 o'clock to 6:37, where people can kind of drop in, they can talk to us, and we'll have maps, we'll have copies. The other thing that we'll have is the zoning hub site reflecting all the changes that we had talked about here, so that we can, have that online as well.
Do we want to have any portion of it as a formal presentation?
Unless you did a quick 5-minute, 10-minute thing at the top of the hour or something
Yeah,
like
that should repeat, otherwise I don't,
Because I don't think you'd want to have one specific time that everyone would need to be there. That kind of defeats the whole
Yeah.
house.
We've tried that in some of our construction project PIMs, and really, the people come and have questions, and then they go.
Right.
Where's my property?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And they end up, the ones that come early miss the presentation, and
Right.
others tend to leave right after it when maybe they still had some questions, so.
Okay. So we'll kind of coordinate with Adam in terms of location, probably at the library you were talking about
If you want a
potentially.
little more room, yeah, and then it gets out of here. The all-purpose room, and then
Mhm.
we can have refreshments if we so desire there.
Okay.
So did you come up with a date?
The third week looked good, other than Tuesday night,
So if we stick
So
with
Monday?
what's been working tonight, that would be the 19th.
Monday the 19th. Exactly a month from today.
Are you gonna be recovered from St. Patrick's Day by then?
Yeah, right, exactly.
That only gives you 2 days to heal.
Mhm.
Boy, I don't know.
Pretty wild, St. Patty's Day on Saturday this year, so it changes things a little bit for folks. Okay, so we're gonna tentatively put that in, and that was an open house, 3 to evening anyway.
Yeah.
Just kind of a drop-in period, and so our planning commission role, members' role is slim to none, right? I mean,
Well, obviously you can be there and you know the people that are going to be walking in more than we would
Sure.
potentially. And just hearing what people are asking and being able, to respond if it's appropriate. Again, it's just going to be a one-on-one,
Yeah.
Or if we're both kind of busy with customers, just kind of stall them.
Yep. Keep 'em-
Somebody to talk to them about the process.
And then you have the future land use map up, you have, all the
Yep.
visuals and things, so people are able to look at things and react. Okay.
Yep.
Interactive website.
Yeah. And there's, and they say the library is a very large visual electronic, projector and things,
Yeah.
so
Good.
a lot of space to see.
All right, we'll kind of coordinate with Adam on that. And
Entertain a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn? Second have to?
Well, we actually had a quorum with Fran here, and I called it order, so.
Okay.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Stand adjourned.